Hello, welcome to Memo Conversations. I'm video producer Osman Butt. Our topic today is Libya in the last 10 years, accountability, and what is happening and going to take place in the future of that country. My guest today is Elham Saudi. Elham is co-founder and director of Lawyers for Justice in Libya. She is a solicitor with expertise in human rights and international humanitarian law. She has advised a number of Libyan, European, and international bodies in relation to the Libyan conflict. Prior to founding the LFJL, Elham practiced commercial law at Slaughter and May from 2003 to 2010 for clients, including Arsenal Football Club, Cadbury's PLC, and Reuters Foundation, and the World Bank. Elham holds a degree in Arabic and Modern Middle East Studies.
Osman, sorry, I think I sent you a more up-to-date one than that.
Did you?
Yeah, let me just find it. 1 second.
Okay.
Sorry.
We'll cut this part.
There's been so much. No, sorry. I said I'll share a more up-to-date one. And I didn't. Sorry, wait, let me find. That's like woefully out of date. So, is it okay if I send it to you afterwards? Is it too much of a hassle to record it? I'm so sorry. I feel like I'm becoming such a diva in this process, but it's just the chaos in which we were trying to do all of this.
Yeah, I can probably just re-record that first part. If you send it
is that super annoying? You can say that it is. I'm really sorry. It's just because I read it and I'm like, no, there's a better one, well, a more relevant one to what we're talking about, which I think is better because.
Do you have it on hand? Do you have it on hand now?
I can probably find it if I have 2 minutes. Hold on.
Take it down.
I'm so sorry. I'm mortified by this.
I'll pause this for a sec.
Go.
Hello. Welcome to Memo Conversations. I'm video producer Osman Butt. Our topic today is Libya, accountability, and events and the future developments in that country. My guest today is Elham Saudi. Elham Saudi is an international lawyer specializing in international human rights law and international humanitarian law. She is the co-founder and director of Libyans for Justice in Libya, a non-governmental organization.
No, sorry.
You've said the wrong one again? Or?
Sorry, it's Lawyers for Justice. Oh, you read it wrong. It's not me, it's you. Yeah, it's Lawyers for Justice in Libya.
Okay.
The one I just sent you. Yeah. So she's the co-founder of Lawyers. You said Libyan Lawyers for Justice, but it's just Lawyers for Justice.
Oh, okay. I read it wrong. I'll read it again. Okay, third time lucky.
Okay. Sorry, I produce a podcast as well, so I think it's a nightmare to have someone like me. Okay, I'll shut up.
Okay.
Go.
Hello, welcome to Memo Conversations. I'm video producer Osman Butt. Our topic today is Libya, accountability, and justice. My guest today is Elham Saudi. Elham Saudi is an international lawyer specializing in international human rights law and international humanitarian law. She is the co-founder and director of Lawyers for Justice in Libya, a non-governmental organization working on promoting human rights and the rule of law in Libya, including through advocacy, research, and seeking accountability for human rights violations and international crimes. Elham is one of the experts who drafted Libya's first comprehensive law on the protection of women, which is due for consideration by the country's House of Representatives. Elham was a member of the Libyan UN-led political process, the Libyan political dialogue, and was a judge on the panel presiding over the Aban Tribunal, the International People's Tribunal of Iran, atrocities of November 2019. She is a former visiting professor at the Helena Kennedy Center for International Justice. Elham, welcome to Memo Conversations.
Thank you, Osman. I'm happy to be here.
And it is our pleasure to have you here. Well, Usually how we start these is we like to ask a bit about the person and their background. And so that's where I'd like to begin with you. Because obviously you are a member of the Libyan diaspora, and you grew up outside of Libya. So my first question, just to give us a sense of yourself, is, what was it like to be, kind of hard to answer in a way because that's all you've ever been, in a sense. But what was it like to grow up outside of Libya before, obviously, 2011? And how did you relate to the country growing up?
I think the way I feel back then hasn't changed much now. There was a period in between, which I'm sure we'll talk about, where there was a clearer sense of identity. But I think back then, you sort of always identified yourself you always identified yourself by saying what you're not. And so it was always kind of a negative identity. I am not a terrorist. I do not support Gaddafi. I do not believe this is the way to do things. And it was always exhausting because you never really knew what you were. And I think growing up in that period, that allowed us to sort of start drawing a picture of what we might want for Libya, because there was no clear positive picture. Having said that, my parents and my family did a very sort of hard job of making sure we still had a connection. So we always went back, and had summer holidays there. And so my vision of Libya during that period is this very odd mix of a very acute awareness at a young age of the things you don't talk about, which is politics, and a very, very romanticized vision of the beauty of the country, because that's what I got, or what I was shown when I went there.
Yeah, it's kind of interesting because, this is a question I sometimes throw to Iraqi friends of mine, because obviously if you grew up in the 1990s, if you're Iraqi, you have this image of Saddam Hussein as the dominant figure of that country. And that's, he is Iraq in the eyes of the outside world. It's similar for Libyans, because for Libyans, Gaddafi is Libya. Outside of Libya, I mean, the international image of Libya. So what was it like to sort of grow up in the shadow of someone like Gaddafi?
Yeah, I'm glad you corrected that towards the end of the question, because I don't think for Libyans we saw Gaddafi as Libya. We saw Gaddafi as the curse of Libya, and what were we going to do about it? But I still remember, and I still go through this. There isn't an Uber ride where people don't ask me where I'm from, and then immediately the next question is about Gaddafi. Pre-2011, it was, oh, Gaddafi, yeah, he's the madman of the desert, etc. Whatever the propaganda was that was being put out there by the US at the time. But since 2011, the questions I still get asked are the same. That association still exists because that narrative was so compelling. Except now the question is, do you regret getting rid of him? Because what they see now is a legacy, if you like. And I think that's what's important to disassociate, is the man is gone, but a lot of him remains. If you think about Libya, including myself, over 67% of the population at the time that he left was born under his rule. So we knew nothing else. And I think on some level, whether you were diaspora, whether you were in the country, we all grew with a little bit of us inside of us. We always joke that there's a little bit of Gaddafi in everyone, because, that mentality, his green book was so systematically taught that for us to genuinely be rid of him takes a lot of work on ourselves, on our society, on our laws, on our culture, to really be able to get rid of the legacy, which unfortunately for us now is far more powerful than the man ever was.
So I want to say, obviously we'll get into the actual politics of all of this. What did Gaddafi, do in 2011, and how did he what role did he play in the disintegration of Libya? But I'm just wondering, on a sort of personal level, emotionally, how does it feel 10 years on to still being asked about, do you regret getting rid of Gaddafi? What does that question do for you?
It's frustrating. Is the most polite, I think, user-friendly language I could use right now. But I think on some level it highlights a much bigger problem personally, but also on a wider level, that the story of Libya is still misunderstood, because I think it's still framed to the general public by reference to this figure, and either it's living under him or living after him or living before him, but we want to be living free of that legacy. And I think I'm equally frustrated when the 15th Uber driver asks me the same question, but I also feel that it's on me to make sure that I use that opportunity every time to try and correct that narrative. And yes, the situation now might seem to the outside world like it's, it's not much better, or some might say it's worse, but it takes a lot to undo that legacy. And so I think what we need from Libyans, us, and from the international friends of ours is patience to understand that it takes a lot to undo a legacy like that. And perhaps a better way to frame the question, if your listeners ever run into me, is what we're doing about the 15 other horrible men that have led Libya since then as well, not just him. Because what we've inherited is this, people wanting to replicate his model in a different suit. And I think until we shed this and we take an approach that is far more human rights based, far more about genuine participatory democracy, where, people leave their positions. We haven't had many people who've left their positions in Libya. We just get additional governments that we then can start changing the story of Libya. But what we're seeing now is people seeing that storybook and wanting to replicate it somehow, an institution and a system that only really allows for that form of governing. I think we just need to take more time and think about, okay, who are the people that are trying to make a different kind of narrative for Libya? And maybe we give them a little bit more airtime.
Yes, but I'm also, so before we sort of leave this Gaddafi question sort of on a personal level, because obviously even as somebody who grew up in the diaspora, I imagine, the fact that, Gaddafi has a certain reputation for what he does to dissidents, to opposition, to anyone involved in Libyan politics, sort of when you were growing up, what impact did that actually have on you growing up even outside of Libya?
I mean, that was part of the regime's very effective tool of silencing the population, right? So you had those very clear, what they were called liquidation campaigns, which are assassinations under a different name for the diaspora. But we also were privy to what was happening in the country, which was as grievous. So you saw, the public hangings of students on television. We saw, every Friday, people being forced to make confessions to crimes and then seeing the aftermath of what happened to them. All of that was done with the intention very much of creating a fear in the population. And it was successful to a large degree because, there was, even in the news, there was constantly stories of, brothers informing on brothers and parents handing in their children. And all of that narrative was very systematically created by that regime to ensure that politics wasn't even discussed within the home. And I think there were times when, over dinner, I was very young at the time, you would even ask just an innocent question that a child would ask about who is that person on TV, and that would immediately be silenced because who knows who's listening. And that was the kind of mentality that we had to unlearn, and we're still unlearning. And I think one of the biggest legacies of Gaddafi is the mistrust between Libyans that still exists, because that is the entire basis by which he stayed in power. It wasn't because of the strength of his military or strength of his policing or his particular brilliance. It's because he created so much mistrust between one citizen and the other that we could never even have a conversation, let alone a movement against him.
Okay, so take us to 2011. Obviously, you've had protests at this point, beginning 2011, you had protests in Tunisia, which leads to the toppling of Ben Ali. You had protests in Egypt, which eventually Hosni Mubarak is sort of forced to step down. It comes to Libya. Tell us what you're thinking in the moments you start to encounter the fact that there is a protest movement occurring in Libya.
We were always worried that Libya would turn ugly because on either side of our borders, on Tunisia or on Egypt, the institutions were on some level stronger than the individuals. And so the individuals at some point could be sacrificed. As long as in the case of Egypt, the army, would prevail eventually, as we see now, or in Tunisia, there was infrastructure there that meant Abidine could be removed quite quickly. In Libya, we didn't have institutions. And so I think that was very clear to us that, the only way it would happen would require a significant level of investment that was different. And it was, well, we weren't left in suspense for very long because it did turn violent very quickly with Gaddafi releasing his troops on protesters very, very quickly. So as we were learning the lessons of what protesters were doing in our neighboring countries, he was also learning the lessons of what those leaders were doing and what he needs to do differently. And so I think it was clear to us as Libyans that we would have a different experience.
Yes, it was a the events in Libya moved very, very fast. I mean, I remember watching it on TV and seeing, Gaddafi doing initially all of these PR stunts, which were quite, to outsiders seemed quite amusing, where he sat in that little, was it golf cart or whatever it was, and he said he had an umbrella up and saying, I was going to go talk to the youth in the square, but it's raining, so I'm going home. And then, to a lot of the outside world, he was always a comical kind of figure. But of course, to Libyans, he's anything but comical, because in spite of, his weird, idiosyncrasies, he was always going to be very violent.
Yeah, I mean, I don't think it was ever funny to us. I think, his words were still heard beyond the facade. And, he was very threatening. He made direct threats to protesters, and he followed through with those threats. So I think at no point did we see the humor in his actions. But I think, look, you and I have been chatting for a while now, and we still can't get beyond a man who died 10 years ago. And so he is still kind of holding hostage the conversation in Libya. And I find that phenomenally frustrating, because we can't keep framing Libya's uprising or Libya's kind of shift, if you like, away from him through the prism of considering him. I think it would be better use of our conversation to think about those who actually were out on the street, as opposed to, cowards who are hiding in a dungeon.
Yes, and that's definitely where I want to take the conversation. But we need to sort of finish up on this point, because it is something that comes up. Because obviously you have these protests taking place, turns violent with Gaddafi launching a very violent crackdown. And for some reason, people outside Libya seem to have forgotten that it was Gaddafi that initiates the fighting and the violence in Libya. And then there's obviously the UN vote to launch airstrikes against Libya. Libya falls. But I find within the narrative that sort of emerged after that Libya has disintegrated into chaos because Gaddafi was removed. And I always find that puzzling, because, of course, Libya, Gaddafi himself tore up a lot of these institutions himself and brought in the tribes to start fighting, tribes loyal to him, because you saw also lots of defections from the regime. We had, people coming to the UK and so on. And this disintegration effectively was down to him in many ways.
No, and I think one thing to note about the UN vote is it wasn't a regular vote, because it was the Libyan ambassador to the UN who requested this intervention, which is unprecedented, right? So he's one of the first defectors, and he defected while, before he declared that, he used his position in the UN to ask for an intervention, because he knew probably more than most what Gaddafi was capable of. But I think it is important to spend time thinking about what happened in that period, because it is, very easy to forget that this was a Libyan requested intervention. And I think that is important. Okay, we can question how successful an intervention it was, and whether, the international community followed through with some of that, the promises they had made of rebuilding Libya, right? Because this kind of responsibility to protect, which is the mandate under which they entered, also has a responsibility to rebuild, which is, conveniently left to private enterprise. And so I think it's important to remember that the why that intervention happened is always forgotten in this conversation. And I think it's important to think that, that was the situation of our kind of, if you like, desperation at that moment, that our own ambassador felt compelled to ask for an intervention. But I think the intervention is also beyond the military. And I think people also forget that, that we as Libyans wanted an intervention, of a humanitarian intervention and a human rights intervention, because we knew things were going to turn violent. And so we were also at the time asking the International Criminal Court to get involved quickly, because we knew that things were happening. Yet people forget that part of the conversation as well, that those things were happening in tandem, that, we knew that we needed some kind of, physical support, military support, whatever you call it, I was on the side, in my capacity as a human rights lawyer, saying, well, whatever happens there, there's going to be violations and there's going to be international crimes committed. And we need those documented, and we need those who commit them to be held responsible.
Yes, it's a very important thing to be reminded of. But I also now want to be reminded, as of something you just mentioned a bit earlier, about the people who went out onto the streets, because of course, again, we tend to focus a lot on the violence, which in many ways is understandable. But talk to me about the people and the groups that started to emerge on the ground, the protest movements. What did they want? What kind of conversations were happening? What were they trying to do?
Well, I mean, I don't want to give myself more credit than any credit's due. As you correctly pointed out, I was in the diaspora. And so my role wasn't so much in sort of assisting those movements, because I was I was a member of the diaspora. My form of protest, if you like, was very much ensuring that those outside Libya are getting the correct story. And so there was, those of us who were trying to get stories from the inside and take them to the outside. And so, yes, we cooperated very closely with those leading some of the movements in the country to ensure that we got the footage of what was happening, to ensure that we got them being interviewed on television instead of the diaspora. One thing that really frustrated us is that, whenever you turned on TV, there was a handful of people who were telling the Libyan story that all looked like me, and that's not right. And so, we got to a position where we could actually get people in the country comfortable to speak about it as well. And we would hook them up with journalists who wanted to speak to those in the country. We would facilitate and help those journalists who wanted to go into the country. And so we understood very early on that a big part of what was happening, or what needed to happen, was on the legal side to document what was happening. So that's what we were busy with. We were sitting down documenting. The second was to ensure that the Libyan story got out in its full, and not in its sort of, kind of romanticized war story that you sometimes get from journalists. And I think the final element as well is to ensure that there is a communication of what's happening at the international level back to the Libyan public who started this. Because at some point, Libya's fate was hijacked by a self-selected political elite and the international community. And those who were at the grassroots of this were disenfranchised from the process.
Yes, and it's also interesting because, of course, although they talk about this way about the Arab Spring more generally, which is that you had this moment where people were rising up. Now that's all over. It's all about groups and violent groups. But many of the people who took part in those protests are still there. They're still doing things, right?
A lot of them have had to leave the country because things, didn't end. The ugliness didn't end with Gaddafi. We had a period of a year or so where things were what we hoped they would be, where people felt safe. A lot of the diaspora returned. There was a lot of sort of building of the country, but then at some point, very soon after the elections, it became clear that some of the political factions who didn't win weren't happy with that, and so all of a sudden there was a shift of, I guess on some level there was a victor's mentality, right? So at the point when you're fighting for a cause, you tend to play by the rules, and that's what kind of was happening in the beginning conflict in 2011, 2012. Once you win, you, on some level, in your mind at least, inherit the impunity of your predecessors. And that's what we saw. We saw that when those who won positions were being threatened, they ended up starting to use the same tactics, and in fact, some of the same laws that Gaddafi used to crack down on protesters, on human rights defenders, on civil society activists. And we see that to today. That pattern has only increased, if not worsened. This culture of impunity, which was on some level during the Gaddafi era limited to a certain class of him and his followers, now is prevalent at every level. There is impunity in Libya.
And is that the reason you chose to set up co-found the organization Lawyers for Accountability in Libya?
Lawyers for Justice in Libya. I have to get that name right. We set up very much we set up in March 2011, so very early on, and it was a very reactionary organization, as most civil society in Libya at the time was. If you want to talk about Gaddafi's legacy, instead of focusing on his, quirkiness, one of the things we should focus on is under Gaddafi's time, setting up a civil society organization was largely illegal, and in some instances could get you the death penalty depending on what your organization was doing. And so it was a real sort of moment when people could set up organizations. So you saw a flurry in 2011 of organizations. LFJL is one of those. We were set up very much as a diaspora organization. We were 6 lawyers, all Libyan, all in different jurisdictions around the world. That ended up being jurisdictions that played a role in Libya. So I was in London, there was someone in Paris, someone in DC, someone that we didn't know at the time, but then would eventually become very vital in Doha, because these are all capitals that ended up having a role in the Libyan scenario. So France, US, the UK and Qatar on some level. And so we saw our role as very much in that moment to say, we're there to support what is needed on the ground and to educate those that want to intervene outside it. And so we almost saw ourselves as this like translation service, right? Where we could translate to the internationals what was happening in Libya, and we could translate international norms and requirements to those who purported to be the leaders of Libya at the time, the National Transitional Council. So that's kind of how we started. It was very much, a gritty startup, if you like.
So, but you obviously expanded the role of your work, right? From what I gather. So you started off doing these translations, you're working between Libyans and the international community, but how did it sort of evolve into what you do now?
So, 12 years on, we are a much more established organization. We now work through 3 programs. So we have our research and capacity building, which is where the learning happens. There we kind of, we see our role very much as trying to fill this knowledge deficit on Libya. So our research tackles a variety of issues. So, recent reports have looked at like online violence against women, which is a really, really terrifying phenomenon. To looking at, more recently on how the crimes against migrants in Libya amount to crimes against humanity, and putting the ICC on the spotlight for why they're not investigating that more thoroughly. And coming up later this year, we've got something looking at the kind of violations that happen in secret detention facilities in Libya, as well as looking at ourselves and the crackdown that civil society has been sort of subjected to. The capacity building element is where we work with our Libyan partners to increase their capacity, whether they're lawyers, activists, on how to do this work safely, primarily, but also more effectively. Our second program is an advocacy and outreach, and that's probably this kind of stuff where we're trying out there, we're out there trying to make sure the Libyan story stays relevant, that the Libyan what's happening in Libya is on people's radar, because it's very easy to get lost in the news cycle. And that's important because, if you're not in the news, you're on no one's agenda. And politically, Libya is still very much an international there's an international mandate over Libya's future. And so, our role there is to inform those who play that part to ensure that they play it in a more sensitive to the Libyan situation way, but also take into consideration really questions of human rights. And then our third program is our law program, which is the one where we look at the kind of nitty-gritty of case building. And that's where the accountability in the more traditional sense of the word sits.
Interesting. But I'm also wondering, because of course, as you're doing this work and you're talking to people on the ground in Libya, you're also picking up things that are happening in society. What do you feel like the idea of justice, what does justice look like in the context of Libya? What do people say to you about issues and violations that are happening in the country that they think is important and is either not being addressed or not being taken to, they don't feel is being communicated well enough?
Mm-hmm. So normally I don't like answering questions where people ask me what I think other people think. But in this instance, I'm happy to do that because a year ago we did a survey on perceptions of justice in Libya, and so I feel like I'm well equipped with that data to try and formulate an answer. I think the healthiest answer I could give is that people are far more aware of the pressing need of justice than ever before, because they've really felt the lack of it. In a way, the violations that have occurred in the last 10 years, it's very hard to find someone who hasn't been impacted on them. Even as early as 2016, 2017, we did a study there, and even back then, we found that one in five households had someone missing or kidnapped at some point. And so this is that prevalent, and we've moved on from that date. So I think people understood that justice wasn't up for compromise in a way that's more acute than it was in 2012, because we had a similar survey in 2012. And for me, I think one of the most interesting learnings I personally had from this research is, whereas people were happier to see a toss-up between what politicians were telling them reconciliation was and justice, to now understanding that justice is a prerequisite to reconciliation. And until people feel like they've actually had their their rights met and have had genuine restitution for what they suffered, they're not interested in having a conversation about a reconciliation model that's based purely on amnesties and impunity.
Interesting, yes. And so just thinking about, obviously, we've also mentioned that you look at international norms and laws. Do you feel that they address adequately the issues that Libya is giving rise to? Because in other situations, I've heard people say to me, international laws may well be updated or changed based on what's happening in, say, Syria or elsewhere. When it comes to something like Libya, do you feel that, the norms and laws adequately address what is happening in Libya?
Yes, in the sense that the laws and the norms exist, and there is within them what is necessary to address the situation in Libya. What's lacking is not the law or the norm. What's lacking is political will and follow through. And I think that those are two different things. And the comparison you gave, for example, in Syria, or a more recent example is Ukraine. Look, it's the same international laws that are there. They didn't write any new laws really for Syria or Ukraine. They just knew how to utilize them better, or they chose to, not new. They know how to do that. They chose to utilize them more effectively in certain conflicts than others. What I as an activist, as a human rights defender, I'm not going to be saying any one conflict is more worthy than the other, because that's the kind of dynamic that often people want to get you into. But I think the important thing to note here is the shortcoming isn't in the laws. The shortcoming is in their application. And there is the conversation to be had about the political will to do something meaningful in a situation like Libya.
So speaking of political will, which I think gets us onto events that have happened in Libya, I want to start obviously in Libya and then maybe move to international actors like EU and so on. But because obviously a lot has happened in the country. I mean, you've had, as you've mentioned previously, you had a period of relative, after the revolution, you had a period of relative calm. You then had elections, but then you had a sense of victor's justice. Then as we sort of get to, say, 2014, we see the major split happen between Haftar and his forces calling on the GNU and calling them, illegitimate. He's going to form a breakaway army. So what accounts for all these, why did all of this happen? What has been happening?
I mean, I'm not a political or security analyst, right? So for me, the answer is a different one, perhaps than the one you're looking for. But for me, really what happened is there was lack of rule of law and there was a disrespect of human rights. That's what happened. Someone can talk to you about the chronology of this happened on that day and that happened on that day, and well, he lost ground there. To me, that all comes down because of this culture of impunity and this lack of rule of law. And that there is no respect for human rights, be that from the Libyan actors or from those who are backing them or those who are overseeing these processes. These are seen as nice to have issues as opposed to essential prerequisites to peace. Now, obviously, I would say that, right? This is my bread and butter. This is what I meant to say. But maybe it's better if I give you examples of this because, as you mentioned in my bio, I was one of the 75 selected by the UN to be part of the Libyan Political Dialogue Forum, which was meant to see one of the many transitions, but this last one that got us the current government. And there, I think there was a really live example of how if you sacrifice human rights in a conversation like a political process, you end up with the results that we have today. So a very simple conversation that we were having around vetting of who is able to be considered by the LPDF to be the selected, because it's not going to be an election, prime minister for Libya. One of the key elements that I was pushing for as one of the sole voices on human rights in that forum is that, well, there needs to be a clear vetting process which doesn't allow those who are implicated in human rights violations or corruption to be able to be chosen by us. That was resisted, understandably, by some of them around the table, but also surprisingly for some by the UN mission at the time as too high a standard, too high a barrier for the situation in Libya. Well, what does that give us in the end? It gives us the two finalists as two men, one implicated in one of the biggest attacks on protesters in Libya's history and implicated in a lot of blood on his hands, and the other one with a lot of money in his pockets for corruption. And so those were our two final options, and we ended up with the money over the blood. But, you know, I was attacked by people within the process for abstaining on that vote. But I think it's really important to take a moment, because if we had a proper vetting process, then at the very least we could have eliminated some of the bad options, but there wasn't, and there's no will on the international community to do that, because that creates a longer process, a more expensive process that needs more expertise, and one where frankly they're going to have to let go of some of the people they've been backing. And I think that is what happened to Libya. It's not Haftar and it's not an army and his militia, and it's not Dbeiba and his bank accounts. It's those who enabled those people to have a say in Libya's future because they did not care enough about the rule of law or human rights, who tell us that it's cute and that we should, you know, what we're talking about is phase 2 of this. Once we've got a government and once we have an election, then you have human rights. Well, no, because you're not ever going to have a legitimate government and a sound election if you don't have the guarantees for freedom of association, freedom of expression, and for people to be able to be saying, this person doesn't represent me.
Yes, it does. It's an interesting one to think about, because when I look at whatever the European Union or, say, individual states in Europe or even in the West deal with Libya, it doesn't seem to be the case that I don't recall hearing very much about the internal situation in terms of human rights and so on. What I hear a lot about are things like migration issues, so refugees coming into the country, trying to prevent it. It feels as if, you know, there is no will to do anything about Libya. They just want to, of course, control things like migration flows and also oil exploration as well. It doesn't feel like there's any interest in doing anything else with Libya.
But if you probe your question, you'll get your answer, because first of all, migration issues are human rights issues, right? Because what's happening to migrants en route and that is some of the most heinous human rights violations, amounting, in our opinion, to crimes against humanity. But those aren't disconnected. It's not, despite of this is what they're doing. It's because of that, right? So the main interest for the EU is to quell migration. And so not only will they turn a blind eye to violations, in fact, they're complicit in them. They fund the Libyan Coast Guard, which is responsible for a lot of violations. They enter into deals with the militias, they like to call them groups or whatever they give them as their official name, to do deals with them, because the institutions that manage the migration in Libya or you know, the illegal migration, whatever they call it, the DCIM, the Department for Combating Illegal Migration in Libya, those who are in that are people with whom the EU does work and who are people who are implicated in serious violations. And so when we're talking about the EU's lack of interest, that's not the question. It's the EU's complicity. And actually, when the UN's fact-finding mission on Libya earlier this year said that in ink, on paper, the EU just came out and said it didn't recognize those findings. That's impunity. And that's impunity at the highest level, because not only is the EU showing its own impunity, it's also encouraging its collaborators in Libya to that this is absolutely acceptable to disregard a UN report that implicates you in a crime. And so obviously the Libyan actors followed suit, saying, we don't recognize this report, we don't recognize this report. And then the UN support mission in Libya effectively buries it. And now we have, you know, a strong report that indicates some serious violations. and name some serious perpetrators that has been buried effectively by the international community. So when we think about this question, it's not that the EU or whoever is disregarding the human rights violations in Libya. No, it's hiding their complicity in the violations in Libya.
Yes, and so this is obviously coming from the EU itself, because of course one of the issues that did sort of come up with Libya is that different European countries took slightly different stances in Libya, but it doesn't seem to, because obviously, talking about the political factions, some were backing certain factions, others were backing other factions. But it seems to be obviously the case, as you rightly point out, that irrespective of that, fundamentally there was a shared interest, and that shared interest was to be complicit in the human rights violations to stop migration.
Yeah, and I think I'm not going to enrich the conversation on that level because I'm not a political analyst, so I don't really have much insight on the motivation for why France is backing one side or Italy's backing it. And frankly, it's irrelevant in my line of work, because to me, what's most relevant is that in these engagements, all these countries are granting their credibility to perpetrators of violations on the ground. That's it. They're dealing with people who are illegitimate. That's it. They're dealing with perpetrators. And so I think those are the questions that need to be probed of the international actors, because so often we get lost in the kind of detail of who's backing whom and for what and when and why and in which conflict and in which fight. That's really important for those who are looking at the political side. For me, as a lawyer and someone looking at the legal side, I'm thinking each of these are potential perpetrators that we should be considering for their role in this, whether it's enabling, funding, directly or indirectly, or at the very, very least, providing some kind of cover to violators when they visit their countries by bringing them in as guests of the state, right? So not only are they not helping us do our work, they're blocking us from doing our work in many ways. I don't know how many of your listeners or your viewers speak Arabic, but there's a phrase in Arabic that says like "La yarham khali rahmat Rabbi," which means like you don't give grace and you don't let God's grace help either. So they're like in the situation where they are complicit in the country and they are somehow blocking our abilities to seek accountability outside it.
So today in 2023, when we talk of violations, could you just sort of give us a sort of survey of what we're talking about by violations of human rights in Libya?
Yeah, I mean, I think one of the things that I always find interesting in my line of work, and I use the word interesting cautiously, is the amount of people that apply to work for us who are not Libyan. And I always ask the question of, why Libya? There's so many other conflicts happening. Why do you want to come work on Libya? And what's an honest answer, but also a really depressing one is, well, Libya is a really interesting conflict for the sheer amount of violations. And so as someone who's interested in this work, it's quote unquote rich. And that breaks my heart every time I hear that response. But I say it now just to highlight the volume, so, we see the full range of violations from the kind of almost, if you like, systematic administrative ones of, stopping the ability of civil society to set up, to register, to get in a bank account, all that kind of stuff that prevents your work, down the spectrum to being silenced through smear campaigns and hate speech systematically all the time against human rights activists, to the next level of arbitrary arrests, detentions, extrajudicial killings, kidnappings by non-state actors, enforced disappearances, torture, sexual gender-based violence, and it's it sounds like a long list where I'm just trying to name all the violations I can remember, but it's because we've documented every single one of those, and it's as it's my country. It's always so heartbreaking every single time we document one of these violations, because it is so real and it's so we talk to victims every day, and so I find it so frustrating when sometimes the kind of feedback or the response you get from the international community is that, yeah, but the scale or the gravity isn't that bad yet, right? So we have to reach some kind of magical number for it to catch the attention of people. And I think that's what we're battling with, and this kind of desensitization to human rights violations, which goes all the way back to that thing of culture of impunity that prevails everywhere, that it's okay for this kind of stuff to exist in a country like Libya. It's okay. It hasn't reached an alarming level yet. We don't need to put out a statement yet. And that's what we deal with every day. You know, we this balance of documenting and hearing firsthand accounts of what's happening and trying our best to translate that to the world, and the world telling us, hasn't hit the mark yet. And then you want those activists to continue working and not get fatigued and not get exhausted and not lose hope. And so that's the kind of balance of the work. It paints quite a dismal picture, but I think it's important to remember that, you know, and I think every time I interview someone for the job, I almost don't want to hire the people who say that. But at the same time, it's true. You know, that's why people want to work on this country, because there's a lot to work on.
And so I'm sort of wondering here, based on what you're saying, because it sounds obviously doing the type of work that you're doing takes a huge toll on you and your staff members who have to sit. Obviously, nothing compared to the people suffering in Libya, but it still takes a toll on people, you know, like your staff members and so on. So, what sort of, you know, kind of care do you give to yourself for that? How do you, you know, deal with the sort of mental stress that comes with? Because of course, people listening, there will be people who are about to go into this line of work as well, not just on Libya, but in other places. So I think it's kind of interesting for my audience to hear this.
And I think that's a really important question. And I think it's one where I never want to be comfortable with the answer, because I think, you know, the work is demanding. It takes its toll, often because actually a lot of the time the victims are civil society actors. So they're people that we know, or we can see ourselves in them. Especially at the moment, there's a severe crackdown on civil society that's happening in the country. And so, you know, some of the cases we document are of those people we've worked with and we know very well. So there's a few things that we do as an organization, but I feel that it's, you know, we need to know when to take breaks and we need to know how to manage expectations, because I think it's one of the hardest things is to talk to someone who's going through that and not want to promise them the earth. And I think that sort of ends up hurting both sides. And so knowing how to have the conversations in a way that is fair to the person and to yourself, to make sure that they know what they're getting out of this and they sign up to what you can actually offer them, is a really big part of this job. And I think a lot of the time that's where things go wrong, is where people over promise and can't deliver, and then that takes its toll on you. I think we're built, you know, as an organization, we spend a lot of time listening to each other and supporting each other. And, you know, I'm not from a background where you feel comfortable praising yourself, but I think, you know, having female leadership is a plus in a situation like this. I think we find that there, you know, it's a more empathetic environment, but I don't think there's ever an answer where I will be satisfied, because really what we're working towards is becoming redundant, right? We want a place where there is no job for us. That's the ideal scenario. And we spend a lot of time thinking as well about those whom we support and what we can do for them. And that's on both levels, the victims themselves, where we do support, we provide psychosocial support to every victim who wants it, that we document. And that's a policy that we will not shift on. But we also do support the activists we work with on the ground who support us in getting that information, because they're also receiving it as well. And so there is a lot to think about in that whole chain of us collecting the evidence. And there is a moment where we have to constantly be asking the existential question of, is it worth it? Like, right, what are we trying to achieve here? And I think that's why it's important that we ensure that what we do is what we're being told is needed, as opposed to what we think is needed. And that's why we do things like this, you know, the research I talked about, which is we're going out there and asking people what their perceptions of justice are. whenever we design a new project, we ensure that we ask the stakeholders what they actually want, because often they tell us, we're really not interested in the ICC. Like, we do not want to be talking to them. They've been with us for 11 years. We've not seen an arrest. Like, talk to me about something else, you know? And I understand that perspective, right? So you also need to make sure that you match the person in the case to a mechanism or a process that they feel will on some level empower them, even if it's a long time before we see a result.
Yes. So tell us also, I mean, so you've mentioned various violations, you've talked about different things and what people are saying to you. I want to sort of zoom in a little bit on women's rights. So obviously the situation for women's rights in Libya is obviously not good, which can be seen by the fact that we've mentioned a lot of different violations, which impacts everyone in society, but especially women's rights. So where are we today with, you know, if you're a woman in Libya, what is the situation like for you, you know, on a daily basis? What's in regards to law and violations specifically?
I think the easiest way to say that is that it's regressed steadily and constantly since 2011. You know, you were talking about the first protesters. Well, the romantic version of the Libyan uprising is that the very, very first protesters were the mothers of those obviously in prison. And so women were very prominent in the uprising in Libya. Women were very prominent in the first National Transitional Council, which is the first kind of self-declared government of Libya. But they have steadily been taken out of the public sphere. And we've seen assassinations of women that are high profile in Libya. We've seen disappearances of women that are high profile. And we've seen very, very systematic and targeted campaigns online, which, in our opinion, you know, the harm caused by them does amount to torture, the mental harm caused by them. Because if you think about women who have lost access to the public space, and so they then move into the online space, and they're shut down as well. It's very, very isolating for women. But we've seen, you know, the use of Gaddafi era laws very much to target women specifically. The recent cybercrime law that came out last year has, as far as I'm aware, only been applied to women so far. We've seen restrictions on freedom of movement that are targeted at women. So just, you know, in the last year, you can't travel without a chaperone in Libya unless you fill in Tripoli, unless you fill in a declaration as to why you're traveling and what you're doing. And obviously the intention there is to collect data primarily on women who are activists, because they are the ones who tend to travel the most, or women entrepreneurs, or women who are independent. And so, you know, that data collection to some seems harmless at the moment, but we're conscious of how that's likely to be used, given that it's the internal security agency that's collecting it. And it's not a pretty picture. And I think if you look at the increase and disproportionate targeting of women, and then look at the, you know, the kind of way out that's happening and what the political process that is being designed has really very little regard to the needs of women to ensure that they can participate fully and safely in this process. I don't, you know, unless that changes significantly, and that's something we're working on, we will get a situation where women continue to be left out of key spaces. And when they are in them, will be scapegoated for every single public scandal, like we've seen recently with the foreign minister, who is being scapegoated for an incident which I'm sure came at the instruction of a more senior person who is likely a man. Well, it has to be, because there's no more senior person than her. That's a woman, but she will be the one that's sacrificed in this process. And that will be used as an excuse not to allow women in the next round of the process. And so I think there is something to be thought about here, that between this combination of legal crackdown, sort of executive orders like the ones we're seeing at the airports, religious fatwas who, you know, that contribute to this dialogue, and a general movement in society that's being shifted because of the narrative that's constantly being put out there about women and especially women human rights defenders, being the number one enemy of the country effectively. unless there is a serious and spotlight put on this, this is going to be a horror, a really difficult time coming for us, and certainly a lot of our resources in that. But I think the political process, and I know that your audience is very political, that let's look at what those pictures look like that come out of the political process, and how many women or any that we can spot in that process.
Just on a sort of personal level, I mean, this is a sort of political question, but I want to ask on a personal level, when you're looking at, because a lot of this comes back to, as you pointed out, political will to do things. Do you think you will ever see in your lifetime the political will emerge to actually, address these human rights issues within Libya?
I mean, a part of my job description is to be optimistic, right? Because otherwise, what am I doing with my life? But I also think that political will is not something we wait to see. I think political will is something we seek to create. And I think that's kind of why I'm doing this interview, or why we write our reports, or why we do our advocacy or our outreach. Political will doesn't just appear. It's created, and it's created through pressure. It's created through naming and shaming. It's created through accountability. And it's created through welcoming those very few who once in a while do something right to kind of encourage people along the path. But so yes, my answer to your question is perhaps I don't have the longevity to wait to see it, but I certainly have the energy to continue to try and create it.
That's great. I like the fact that you also sort of gave us an indication of how you think that might emerge if it was to emerge, because that was a connected question. So just like to sort of finish up, we're very close to finishing now. What is the sort of future direction of your organization, the Lawyers for Justice and Accountability in Libya? What are you hoping to do going forward?
I think more of the same. We're doubling down significantly on our documentation and case building. So, the ICC, although it has issued, I think, 4 arrest warrants this year and is requested 2 more, it has lost its sort of any backing in the country because people are just fatigued by it. But we continue to support their efforts. We also continue to work in countries other than Libya that have systems that allow us to bring cases. So, it's called universal jurisdiction, which is where there are certain crimes like torture, for example, where you can seek recourse in a third country because of the gravity of the crime. So we're looking at countries where that is possible. And we are spending a lot of time to ensure that civil society in Libya feels supported, both in every sense of the word, whether it's in training and capacity, but also in terms of where we can to financially support civil society actors in the country, but also to ensure that we are there in the case that they need support for safety as well. So we have the Ali Nuh Fund, which is our fund to support human rights defenders in danger. So if anyone wants to support that from your listeners, they can make a contribution to that. It goes on solely for the purpose of supporting human rights defenders who are in danger. But I think, we feel that we have the right structure now, and it's more of doing more of the same and sending out a clear message that justice is not always fast, but it's always there, and it will come. And I think, it's just a matter of time, and we need to keep going. But it's important that we don't lose heart. Because it's a long fight, but it's a worthy one. At least that's what we think.
Is there any final thoughts you'd like to leave us with?
Yes, for you, stop asking questions about Gaddafi. Stop. It's been 12 years. The man has long been buried. You'll soon get that when his son runs for elections next year or whenever the elections happen. So give us some respite from Gaddafi questions in this small period between father and son. But I say that flippantly, but it's also important. There's a lot of lives that have been lost to try and write a different version of Libya's story. So just for their sake, let's try to remember those other than him who've died in this conflict.
Elham Saudi, thank you for talking to us at Member Conversations. I know this hasn't been some of the topics we're going into is not easy to talk about, so I especially would love to thank you, and we're very grateful for the time you've given us today.
Thank you. It's always great to have hopefully a listening audience.
And to our audience, thank you for tuning in. If you'd like to see this one or previous Memo Conversations, you can go to our website. But I'd also like to thank all of you for coming along, and please do tune in next time for more Memo Conversations.